People in the public sector love to have talks about talks, and that doesn't just refer to politics and the negotiations that have, well, we are so used to here in our country going back to 1994, right to the modern day. It also applies to trade, and there's talks about talks, I think, with a framework agreement between South Africa and China on trade. Now, the preeminent voice on trade in South Africa is Donald MacKay, and he joins us now to give us some insight into whether this is talks about talks, whether this is just the South Africans trying to show the middle finger to the United States, given the way the United States has been treating South Africa, or whether there's more to this relationship, as a proposed relationship between South Africa and China. Donald, thank you for joining us. Let's start at the beginning. What exactly is this framework agreement between South Africa and China intended to achieve? Am I being unfair by saying it's talks about talks?
No, I don't think so. It's a very unusual agreement. Firstly, it's incredibly short. There's very little in the agreement. Lots of talking about we agree that we all want to achieve wonderful objectives, but very little in the agreement that tells me how any of that will be accomplished. Now, the agreement is then accompanied by a offer that South Africa is considering making to China. And that offer is on what we will open up in return to getting access to the Chinese market. And when I look at all of this, it's not clear to me, certainly from an economic perspective, what either South Africa or China, for that matter, is getting out of this, making me think there's something else going on here, which has got nothing to do with the economics, but everything to do with politics. And my guess there would be something to do with the US.
So we cross with the US and we're going to show the US we've got friends.
Well, yeah, but the problem we have with this is that Trump will be out of office at some point, despite his best attempts. But this agreement is going to probably live for quite a long time after Trump. So we've got to be very, very careful of making long-term commitments to fix what is a short-term problem. And I'm not sure it does anything to help solve the problem, by the way.
Okay, so there's a few things in there that really did confuse me. I think it's paragraph 10 says that it's not binding. So if you're going to have an agreement and it's not binding, what's the point of having it? And then it talks about putting it together or putting an agreement together by March. That's next month. And somehow you think of the complexities that are involved in tariffs and trade and everything else. You know it better than me. Is that even feasible?
Well, it depends. So let's maybe deal with the first part first. So these sort of framework agreements are typically non-binding. They're just setting the tone for typically something that will become binding afterwards, and just saying, we're going to look at this. So I'm not too worried about that at the moment. It would be impossible to put together a meaningful agreement by March. So typically a trade agreement takes years to negotiate because the concessions on either side, it's complicated. There are lots of interests that have to be considered, lots and lots of complicated modeling to be done. This is not possible inside of a month. It simply isn't. And so whatever will be signed off a month from now is either going to have to also be something non-binding, which I would assume it's not, or it will have to be something that does very little, where kind of nobody is giving anything on either side, in which case I don't really know why we're doing it. So none of this makes any sense at all, Alec.
The Chinese are known, and you need to guide us here, as being very good negotiators. They certainly seem to have negotiated terribly well with the World Trade Organization. South Africans haven't got that reputation. Is there anything we need to be fearful of in this respect?
Yeah. So firstly, China is particularly good. China have exceptional skills, which they tend to bring to bear in all of these things. And because China is not particularly worried about getting vote, or I should say the CCP is not terribly worried about getting voted out of power, they can afford to take much kind of longer term decisions versus in a democracy. So the answer I would have is that China is incredibly transactional. And if we don't understand what the transaction is that is actually happening here, I would just say great caution should be applied.
That's a very interesting point. When we step back from all of this, we have relationships at the moment, trade relationships with the United States, which we benefit from. We have run a trade surplus with the US, and then we have a trade relationship with China where we pay them. We have a deficit with them. Is this not a risk if this framework goes further, that we will just be exaggerating an already unfortunate situation if you look at the two partners?
Yeah, well, so this is where it gets really weird. So the nub of this is China is saying, at least as far as I can tell, we'll give you access to all of our market and we'll remove all the duties. And then in turn, we've put together 3 potential offers. And when I run the numbers on those offers versus the benefit we would get, so China, from their perspective, would forfeit around 4 billion rands worth of import duties if they were to do what they do, and our kind of trade pattern holds. And South Africa would forfeit around 4 million. So there's a 1,000-fold difference, which is enormous. So why would China do that? I don't know why they would. What do we get out of it? Very little. And the reason we get very little is the products that we send in great volume to China, even though some of them attract a duty, the duty tends to be nominal. So think platinum, for example, which is an enormous export, iron ore, etc. There are small duties on these products, but those duties don't affect the trade. So I don't believe reducing those duties would see those volumes increase. And on the other hand, the concessions we are giving are on products where there's very little trade with China anyways. So it's on either side, there doesn't appear to be anything material. Now, for example, the one sector which I think could benefit would be agriculture. So agriculture is about the only thing where we could do better and where we have some constraints to that. But those constraints are typically not driven because of the import duties. They're driven by other non-tariff barriers. So, for example, a very complicated and difficult process to get different agricultural products approved within China for sale. China typically will only process a single product at a time from a country. So if we're kind of applying for blueberries, then we have to wait for blueberries to be approved before we can apply for chicken or whatever else. So the challenge we're going to have is even if the duties were taken off on all of these agricultural products, we may struggle. So for those products where we have been approved, removing the duties should benefit us without a doubt. So that could definitely be a good thing. Unequivocally, we shouldn't kind of look a gift horse in the mouth on that. But on the rest of it, the minerals, nothing there. And on manufactured goods, there's pretty much nothing that we can manufacture that China can't manufacture cheaper and better. So it's really an agreement about agriculture, yet I don't see any of the issues that typically deal with agriculture in the agreement. And so that also, I think, is problematic.
Those non-tariff barriers, how wide are they, and what goods, what products are exempt from them at the moment? I'm trying to find out with you who the beneficiary would be of this.
Yes. So we already send products like citrus to China, which means citrus at some point in the past got approved. So the non-tariff barriers with agricultural goods typically fall into a category called sanitary, phytosanitary measures. So sanitary being animal products, phytosanitary plant products. And in this category, a country that is importing would typically have a fear that coming along for the ride would be a pathogen, whatever it might be, a mold or an insect or who knows what that rides along with this thing. And when it arrives in their country, it creates a problem with their own agricultural sector. And so it's 100% legitimate for countries to manage that risk. One can tell what has happened when we've had, for example, the foot and mouth disease. Nobody wants our beef to travel to their market and bring that with. And so it is legitimate to have that concern. But China's process around approving appears to be deliberately slow. So it's not that they don't have the capacity to do it faster. They appear to slow walk it for whatever reason. And I'm not sure what those reasons are. If we're going to move agriculture in volume, particularly agricultural goods we're not currently sending there, that is going to be an essential problem to solve.
So I suppose the $10 million question is, are you going to advise your clients to switch their focus from the United States to China, or start gearing up for China? Or are you going to be advising importers in South Africa to watch out, or perhaps manufacturers in South Africa to watch out, because we're going to see a flood of Chinese goods coming into the country, even more than currently are?
No, so let me maybe deal with your last point first, which are the imports. The concessions that we are giving on imports are so small as to not worry me too much. But, for some weird reason, we're even giving concessions on products that already don't attract a duty. So I would argue, in fact, the contrary, that South Africa could benefit from potentially opening up more to China. We've just got to be selective in what that is and the pace of opening, etc. None of which we of course know. Regarding what I would advise my clients when they ask would be, I don't think there's anything substantive here. But for those people in the agricultural sector, I would absolutely insist that way more detail be put out before anything else is done. What I am concerned about, though, is the process that we are going through to arrive at this point. So we seem to have gotten to where we are by a minister going to China, striking an agreement. The agreement, this framework agreement, although not binding, should still have found its way to NEDLAC before being signed. That's important, so people can look at it before you've made the commitment. Doesn't help to look at the agreement after the commitment is binding. And I don't understand the logic. I would like government. I mean, I'm sure they have perfectly good ideas for this, but I'd like to better understand why South Africa is better off with this agreement. And I'm not being cynical. We may very well be, but it's not clear and obvious why we would be. And I think it's incumbent upon the people involved with this agreement to explain, not in political platitudes, but with real data and what the opportunity is. Alec, we don't have a good history with trade agreements. We have a ton of them in place. For the most part, they're very poorly utilized. So we negotiate agreements which have limited economic benefits. And a part of that is nobody knows what's in these agreements. They don't know how they work. A typical agreement, like the agreement we have with the EU, is over 1,000 pages long. So there are a small group of people like myself who do work through those details, but for the average person, they don't. And so we have strange trade agreements which appear to serve no purpose, but can cost quite a lot of money to negotiate. And I'm nervous that we end up with something similar here, or even worse, something which is actively harmful, because we don't fully understand what the thinking is.
John Steenhuisen has come under a lot of pressure for his handling of the foot and mouth disease disaster here in South Africa. He has, however, been crowing from the rooftops about the agricultural deals that he's done in China. Are they more of the same of what you've just described now, or has he managed to perhaps understand the complexities there better and opened up new markets, as he tells us he has?
Well, as with all politicians, I'm less concerned about what they say than what they do. I'd like to see the detail. The detail tends to always either lag or never appear. So, again, there are all the exciting bits. You're meeting all of these high-powered people. You're having these conversations. But ultimately, for a trade agreement to work, it has to increase the value of our GDP in a year. If it doesn't do that, then we're wasting time. Trade agreements are not there so that politicians can fly to and fro. And if the industries involved, if our manufacturers, farmers, miners, whatever, are not actively involved in this process, then I have no idea how the politicians and bureaucrats are figuring out what to do. And with almost all of our experiences of this, there's very little meaningful interest in participation. What tends to happen is you're given a fait accompli and you're told you have a couple of days to review it and give us your feedback. And I fear that we're in the same boat. So I haven't seen Mr. Steenhuisen's calculations or data or anything. And I'd be happy to look at it and give you a more informed view if I can get it.
I don't think anybody, if you haven't seen it, then surely not too many people in South Africa have. Donald, you did mention at the outset that there might be something else to this. There might be something else going on. What's your best guess on what that is?
Well, it is nothing but a guess, Alec. But I've got to think this links up with the US. And I understand that in a way. I mean, what President Trump is doing, in my mind, is just unconscionable. I don't understand any of his logic. So, I've been very openly critical in a pretty unfiltered way around the US. But that doesn't equate to this agreement with China being a good idea. The fact that we have a falling out with one country shouldn't throw us into the arms of another, which I feel might be happening here. The challenge we have with China, and the challenge the whole world has with China is an enormous economy with huge amounts of leverage on all sorts of things. And so this is not to say that we should not do business with China or anything else, but we really need to understand what we are getting out of this before we go into it. So far, if we're doing this to kind of cock a snoot at the US and say, we're going to show you that we can do this, then the upside has to be really substantial. Because when the next sane president takes over in the US, what are we then going to have? Are we going to be in a position that we can't walk that back? And I would argue China is not a replacement for the US. Our pattern of trade with China looks fundamentally different to the US. So doing a deal with China may be wonderful. It is not a replacement for the broken down relationship with the US. And this agreement, to my mind, will do nothing to increase our trade with China in any appreciable way.
I'd love to get your view on this. I remember going to an organization that was highly skilled in looking at the long term, and they explained that if you are a supermarket cashier, then the decision that you make, the action that you make now, will have an almost immediate decision. And you go all the way up the scale, depending on the level at which you operate, until you get to the President of the United States, where the decisions you make will have years before you know if it was good or bad. What is the situation here with Trump? What he's doing today, a lot of people, maybe ignorantly, are cheering him on because he might be playing to their own prejudices. But there are other people who are looking at this and saying, it's going to be sore, but it's almost like smoking. It's not going to kill you now. It might only kill you in years to come. How long is that period when you get to the kind of decisions that he's making that are affecting us here in South Africa?
Yeah, so I'd say we can put everything that Trump has done into one very broad category, which is introducing uncertainty into U.S. relationships. And that will have profound implications over the years. And I would argue the worst of what Trump is doing will only be felt after he is out of office. So I give you an example, but which is not South African related. Just to put South Africa into perspective, Mexico is currently the biggest trading partner of the US. China is the second biggest, or Canada, one of the kind of around there. Africa as a whole accounts for 0.5% of all US imports, and South Africa accounts for 0.3%. So we simply don't matter in the US, which is why Trump can do what he does. There's no consequence really. At a micro level, yes, it's an issue on Nazis or whatever else it might be, but it is not from a country perspective going to really make a difference. Where this becomes much more problematic and where I think the threats in my mind are incredibly more serious than the kind of immediate issues are the uncertainty all of this creates. So let's just have a look at what happened with the threats to Greenland. The idea that one NATO country could potentially invade another NATO country makes NATO very weak. And if the US is not part of NATO, the possibility of Russia doing something in Europe, if they think they can get away with it, is simply far greater. And so I think that is a risk. And that's a risk that would affect everyone. It's not something that is going to be contained to that small area. Likewise, if Trump is viewed to not stick to his word, which I think wouldn't be a surprise to anyone, China's invasion of Taiwan starts to look a lot more appealing. If China believes that Trump will not actually take action, they may very well decide it is just a shot worth taking. And they may find it important to take that shot while Trump is in office. And so I think those sort of things make me really worried, because should a war break out between China and Taiwan, Taiwan loses if there isn't an intervention from elsewhere, without a doubt. But the consequences on the rest of the world will be incredibly serious. Think for a moment of all of the semiconductors that come out of Taiwan. I've been told credibly that the Taiwanese government will destroy those factories before they allow them to fall into Chinese hands, which would wreck the semiconductor market all over the world. Think for a minute of nuclear-armed powers going to war with each other if the US were to intervene, or if Trump feels on the last minute, because this strategic ambiguity is gone, that he now has to act in haste. Things become really frightening. And for the first time, we see nuclear stockpiles start to increase around the world. Countries which never concerned themselves with having nuclear weapons because they felt they were secured by the US, by the way, a position the US wanted. The US never wanted Europe to sit with nukes in Germany after World War II. Likewise, Ukraine, who gave up their nuclear arsenal. The message that is being sent is that the US will not protect you, and the one thing that will save you is being armed to the back teeth with nuclear weapons. And that's a world which I find absolutely terrifying, Alec. And that is the kind of the much bigger risk that I think Trump has introduced into the world through his way of doing politics.
Donald MacKay is the Chief Executive and founder of XA Global Trade Advisors, the sane voice when it comes to trade in South Africa. He will be giving us a keynote address at the Biz News Conference next month. Look forward to that very much, Donald. And thanks again for your contribution today. I'm Alec Hogg from biznews.com.